Alright, so welcome to the Message of Jesus final. We're going to go through this real quick. Feel free to print it out and have your copy there with you and fast forward, rewind as necessary. Number one, the Hebrew spelling and definition of the two words that are translated as Messiah. Okay. The first one here, this is something that we kind of went through right from the very beginning. It's something that right from the very beginning that we went through. And so I'll give you the spelling in case you didn't catch it in class. The first one is, now these are two forms of Messiah, right? So M-A-S-I-A-H. M-A-S-I-A-H. And that is the noun, right? And that noun means anointed, right? That someone is anointed, right? Then the second one is M-A-S-A-H. M-A-S-A-H. Masa, and that is the verb that means to anoint. So that's the verb. So one of them, the first one is the noun, someone is anointed. The other one is the verb, which means to anoint. Right? So both of those are kind of root words that kind of contribute to the concept of the English word that we're translating there as Messiah. It also gets translated as anointed or anointing in different places. That's why we have Jesus' title is the Christ, right? Which comes from the Greek word Christos, which is the Greek version of the word anointed. So the word anointed, the Hebrew version of that is Messiah. The Greek version is Christos, and the English gets all three. So we could say anointed, we could say Messiah, or we could say Jesus the Christ. So we kind of have all three in our vocabulary. All right, number two. Which two groups make up the majority of the usage of the verb anoint in the Old Testament? So what I'm thinking there is the kings and not so much the prophets, but the priests, right? So the prophets, there was only a few references to them in there as being anointed, even though today that's probably what we think of more as being anointed was the prophets. In terms of actual references, the majority of the references to anointing were for the priests and the kings. Right? Number three, after the destruction of the monarchy, what group began to receive the title of anointed? Then that would be the high priest, right? So typically, being a title, someone calling you the anointed one or the anointed, the Lord's anointed, was typically reserved for kings. When the Davidic monarchy fell and we didn't have any Davidic kings anymore, you begin to see that title shift to the high priest. Number four, what is significant about the fact that the woman at the well said she knew about the coming Messiah? Well, the idea there is that the coming Messiah is not mentioned in the Pentateuch, at least not overtly with that phrasing, right? And so that was the only part of the Old Testament that the Samaritans, which is what this woman was, that was the only part that they recognized as being authentic, that they had, that was what they used, was just those first 5 books of Moses. And so I think it's very significant that she is aware of the expectations of the Messiah. That's why she goes out of her way to say it. She's like, we know about this too, or at least she did, right? And so because of the fact that the rest of the Old Testament was not acknowledged by the Samaritans, makes it very significant that she brings it up. And number 5, who is the only person called the anointed king in the major prophets? Right. So in the major prophets, so Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah, the only one called the anointed king is in Isaiah, and that's Cyrus, the Persian king. Okay. Number 6, what is significant about Hannah's prayer of blessing on God's anointed one? This is typically a phrase that we really only see for kings, right? and she is giving, and when you read it in hers, it seems like that's what she's talking about, is that, you know, God's blessing over the king. But she comes before any of the kings. There were no kings at that point. So the fact that she's using the title God's Anointed One before there ever was kings, either it's prophetic or there was different usage for it in her day. Maybe the priest or whoever was working in the priest were perhaps considered God's anointed ones. But it's definitely interesting because that is the title that we see for the kings just after Hannah. And so and prior to that, we don't see that title really being used. Right? Okay, number 7. In your own words, list 3 important principles discussed in class about the order of the ending of the Hebrew Bible as compared to the English Bible. So I'm wanting you to go back in and look. We talked about how the Hebrew Bible ends with Chronicles, and then that I think is important for the beginning of the New Testament. To give you a couple of things, the word kingdom is used 28 times in Chronicles, only 3 times in the whole rest of the Old Testament with that kind of connotation. And so, and then Jesus comes preaching the kingdom. I think that the Gospels are connected, at least in principle there, with the ending of the Hebrew Bible, which is the book of Chronicles, right? Not Malachi like it is in the English Bible. And so Chronicles ends with some distinct things. So that's what I'm wanting. I want you to go back into that lesson and kind of look at some what were a couple of the things that we said that were interesting about that, you know, that we can learn by understanding that their Bible ended with Chronicles. All right. Number 8. Jeremiah prophesied that the literal exile, that should say will last 70 years, but God revealed to Daniel that the true exile would last for how long? So Daniel's upset because, you know, that God's, or at least, you know, concerned here because God said to Jeremiah that the literal exile would last 70 years, but God said, no, it's actually going to be 7 times 70. And so even though they did come back into Israel, the true exile that all of this was about was the fact that we are all in exile from God's presence, going all the way back to the garden. And that exile came to an end with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross 490 years later. So the exile of Israel at the hands of Babylon is a type and a shadow of humanity in exile from God's presence that happened back in the garden. So just as Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, so Israel was cast out of Jerusalem, and they're looking to come back to Jerusalem, but God's got the bigger picture in mind of people coming back into His presence, being connected with Him again, and that was fulfilled through Jesus. So the answer to that question is 490 years. Number 9, list 2 of the discrepancies given in class that discredit the claim that Christianity copied the religion of Mithras. So I gave you a few with that, you know. I'll give you one. You can look up the other ones from the video. But it said that he was that this Mithras person was born of a virgin, is what that author said. You know, he's trying to compare these two. But in reality, if you go back in and look at the ancient documents, it said he was born out of a rock. And so this author who's trying to make this mainstream and kind of make this claim really twisted a lot of the actual facts to make it appear like Christianity and Mithras had a lot more in common than they actually did. Okay. Number 10. In your own words, explain why many of the Jews today believe that the Messianic prophecies have not been fulfilled. So I want you to go back through. We've talked about that a lot. Something to the effect here that there were many of the prophecies that were not fulfilled about worldwide peace, about Israel's national prominence, those types of things that they were looking for, that they consider to have not been fulfilled. Which leads into 11 here also, that what is the Christian explanation for why many of the Messianic prophecies appear to have gone unfulfilled? So the Christian explanation is that there are 2 comings of Christ, and that the Old Testament prophesies both. And so that some of them he's coming as a suffering servant, and that has been fulfilled through Jesus' life, and then some he's coming as conquering king at the end of times, and those are yet to be fulfilled. And so that's why many of the Jews are looking at it as all one appearance and saying, well, Jesus only fulfilled half of these prophecies. Well, the reason why is because he's returning, and the Bible also speaks about that in prophetic form. Number 12, what is the major problem with the current Jewish theory that the Messiah has not come? Well, here's a big problem, because the prophecies that point to the suffering servant and to those types of things, that Jesus' first appearance, all of the prophecies that pointed to that, many of them had timelines associated with them. That the Messiah would have to appear at a certain time, and that was Jesus' generation, right? And so if they're looking for the Messiah, the Messianic prophecies to be all one Messiah, then the big problem is that many of them had to have been fulfilled in that exact generation that Jesus appeared. And so they're kind of stuck there, because they're saying, well, we need somebody to fulfill all of them, but the timeline has passed on many of those prophecies. And so it's kind of like the underlying problem there with their theory is that the timelines required that the Messiah would appear during that early time that Jesus appeared, right? Okay. Number 13, in terms of narrative, the book of Daniel picks up where what book leaves off. So that would be the book of Kings, right? So it's originally just one book, the book of Kings, and where that narrative ends, then you have, in the Hebrew Bible, after Kings, you have all of the kind of poetic things, Psalms, Proverbs, Lamentations, all the writings, they call them. And then when the narrative picks back up again, it comes back in with Daniel. So in terms of narrative, Kings and Daniel are connected, right? Number 14, in your own words, describe 2 ways that Psalm 22 prophesied Jesus' experience on the cross. So this one I want you to do on your own, but Psalms 22 is the psalm that highlights Jesus' experience on the cross, and so I want you to go back in and read that and be able to give 2 good explanations about ways that Jesus is prophesied in that passage. Number 15, list 3 ways that the book of Daniel embodies the symbolism of previous Old Testament stories. Okay, this one I'm also going to give you to do on your own, but I'll give you at least a starter here so that you can kind of understand what I'm thinking. So one of them could be the fact that in Daniel it talks about Daniel in the lion's den, that Daniel has authority over the beasts, that they can't harm him because of the Lord's favor, obviously. But that kind of captures that idea of going back to the garden and Adam having authority over the beasts. And then the other one, just to give you another one to help you out, and go back in and look at the video again, but another possibility is that the opening of the book of Daniel, he doesn't want to eat fruit, or he only wants to eat fruit, rather. He doesn't want to eat meat. And so he's very particular about what he eats, that there is a correct thing to eat and an incorrect thing to eat, which is the same underlying principle that the entire Bible opens with, that God tells them there is something that you should eat, something you should not eat. And so that is captured in that opening story of Daniel, where he doesn't want to eat the king's food. So there's several in the book of Daniel, so I want you to give me 3. Number 16, in what way is the book of Ruth symbolic of Israel's national experience? So I want you to write something to the effect that in the same way that Ruth left, right, and lost everything and were out in a foreign country and then came back, and in her coming back she meets Boaz, her kinsman redeemer, and she is blessed more when she returns than she had even when she left. And it's the same kind of principle of Israel's national experience, was that they have now been exiled to a foreign country, right? They've lost everything, just like that spot where Ruth was. She's in a foreign country, she's lost everything, right? And now they return to Israel, and Naomi as well. That Naomi, Ruth is the Moabitess. Naomi is literally the one that's in the foreign country, and she comes back with Ruth, and the blessing on them is so much, and eventually they become, the beginning of David's line, right? But so the idea is that in the same way that Ruth and Naomi were in this foreign country, they've lost everything, and God brings them back to the promised land, and in the bringing them back, they're blessed abundantly. That's what Israel as a nation was expecting, was that now they're in a foreign country, they've lost everything, but God will one day bring them back, and when He does, they're going to abound with blessing. Number 17, describe how Jesus' experience in the wilderness is connected with the Exodus account. So I want you to write something along the lines of how each of the 3 temptations Jesus counters with words of Moses from Deuteronomy. Right? So while they're in the wilderness, these same temptations and these same issues, these same sins come up with the Israelites in the wilderness, and they kind of fall to them. Right? Jesus does not fall. And in doing so, he is quoting Moses, where Moses is trying to correct these people and keep them from falling. Moses gives them instructions. And so when the enemy is tempting Jesus to make the same types of mistakes in the wilderness, Jesus quotes back the words of instruction that Moses was using in Deuteronomy. All right. And then number 18, in your own words, explain what you think the Jewish expectation for the Messiah would have been like just prior to Jesus' arrival. This one I'm leaving on your own. This is based on what you've learned from the class, what you've done with your homework, what you've read from the challenge of Jesus. I want you to put it all into one kind of coherent thought here. And it doesn't have to be just one sentence, but just one. I want you to kind of paint the picture of what the expectation was like, and that Jesus stepped into, right? Because everybody was expecting something. Right, and so what was kind of that common themes, if you will, of expectation that caused them to see Jesus in different ways, right? Everybody was expecting something, and so when Jesus shows up, some people accepted him, some people didn't. And so you want to look at, based on everything you've learned, including that textbook, The Challenge of Jesus, what do you think were the common expectations that Jesus stepped into, that everyone in that first century was having, right? So what was it that they were expecting when Jesus arrived? Okay, all right. So go back in, look through these ones, maybe pull up some of your videos on anything that you need to, and you should be fine with this one.